There's something about libraries that feels both comforting and unsettling. The quiet whispers of pages turning, the musty smell of old books, and the eerie silence of aisles that seem to stretch forever. These places hold more than just stories. They hold secrets, dark, twisted secrets that lurk beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. The library isn't always a safe haven. Sometimes it's a cage. Sometimes it's a trap for those brave or foolish, enough to explore the forgotten corners of its halls. You see, these places are filled with more than knowledge. They hold the lost, the broken, and the things we can't explain. And for those who venture too deep, it's not just the books that haunt them. The following stories are true. They are the nightmares that haunt the dimly lit corners of libraries, where the line between fiction and reality blurs into something much darker. If you dare, step into the shadows. For once you hear them, you'll never look at a library the same way again. Ready to uncover what lurks behind the shelves? Keep watching if you dare. It was a rainy afternoon when Emily, a young librarian at the local library, stumbled upon something she shouldn't have. The storm outside raged fiercely, but inside, the old library smelled of dust and old paper, just as it always did. The quiet hum of the fluorescent lights above provided the only background noise, almost too calm for such a violent storm. But it was this quiet, this stillness, that made the discovery even more unsettling. Emily had been working her usual shift, cataloging a pile of newly donated books. Most of them were modern, easily classified, but one book didn't belong. It was hidden behind a stack of dusty, forgotten volumes in a corner of the basement storage room. The cover was old, torn at the edges, and stained with something that looked too dark to be just age. The title was nearly illegible, faded almost to the point of vanishing. Intrigued, Emily pulled it from the shelf, wiping away the dust. She turned the pages, expecting the typical musty smell of old paper. But as her fingers brushed the paper, a strange chill crept up her spine. The words on the page didn't make sense. They were fragments, random pieces of sentences that seemed to contradict one another. Words crossed each other out and reappeared, only to disappear again. Whispers of the shadowed world. Once found, never lost. The darkness in the ink calls. The more she read, the more her mind began to blur. The words twisted and turned, each line sinking deeper into her thoughts, pulling her into their rhythm, their dissonance. There was something haunting about them, something that made her feel like she was touching something not quite human, not quite real. She closed the book and shook her head. Her breath was quick, her heart racing. What was this? She couldn't explain it, and yet, she felt an overwhelming urge to keep going, to find out what was in those pages. There was something alive in them. As the clock struck 6, Emily gathered herself and placed the manuscript back in its hiding spot. She decided to return to her desk and continue with her regular work. But the book wasn't easy to forget. Her mind kept drifting back to it, to the strange, fragmented words that seemed to gnaw at her thoughts. When the clock struck 9, Emily found herself alone in the library. The storm outside had worsened, and the wind howled against the windows like something lost and desperate. She had always felt at peace working in the library at night. The quiet, the solitude, it was comforting. But tonight felt different. There was a heaviness in the air, as though something was pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. The library was darker now, the lights flickering intermittently as if struggling to stay on. Emily shook her head, standing up from her desk to check the breaker in the back. The library's power often flickered during storms, but tonight the lights were playing tricks, dimming and flashing in rapid bursts. She'd almost convinced herself it was just the storm when she heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper. At first, she thought it was the wind, but no, it was coming from inside the library. A voice, faint but unmistakable. Emily froze. She stood in the center of the reading room, straining to hear, to figure out where the sound was coming from. It was like a breath, a murmur in the darkness. Then louder. You should never have found me. The words were clear now. They came from the back corner of the room, from the very shelf where the manuscript had been. Her heart skipped a beat. She turned, eyes wide, searching the shadows. But there was no one. Nothing. Another whisper, louder this time, almost a hiss. "You should never have found me." She backed away, her pulse pounding in her ears. She felt lightheaded, dizzy, like the world was spinning too fast. Her feet moved on their own, taking her toward the desk, toward the manuscript she had placed there before leaving earlier. And there it was. The manuscript was open. She hadn't left it like this. It had been closed, tucked neatly between the other books on the desk. But now the pages were open. And the words, they were different. They weren't the fragmented, chaotic text she had seen before. No, now they were clear. Too clear. "You should never have found me." It was the same words as the whisper, only now they seemed to burn into her mind. The book seemed to pulse, as if it were breathing. She could feel its weight, its cold, clammy presence pressing against her chest, pulling her in. She reached out slowly, trembling, her fingers brushing the paper. And then the words began to change again. They shifted and reformed, as if they were alive, moving before her eyes. She couldn't look away. "Now you are mine." A surge of terror gripped her. She pulled her hand away, but the whispers were growing louder now, surrounding her, suffocating her. They were in her head, in her thoughts, crawling under her skin. "You are mine. Forever." The lights flickered one last time before they went out entirely, leaving Emily alone in the suffocating darkness, the whispers now deafening in her ears. She stumbled back, clutching her head, trying to block them out. But they were everywhere, filling the air, drowning her. "Come closer, Emily. Come closer to the truth." A cold hand touched her shoulder. She screamed. But it was too late. The following morning, the storm had passed, leaving a soft mist in the air. The sun shone weakly through the windows of the library, casting long shadows on the floor. The staff arrived to begin their usual morning routine, but they found something that day, something they would never forget. Emily was slumped over her desk, her face pale and frozen in an expression of terror. Her eyes were wide open, staring at nothing. Her hands were tightly clutching the manuscript, but when they tried to take it from her grasp, the book vanished. It was gone, as if it had never been there. The police were called, but they found no sign of foul play. There was no indication that Emily had been attacked or harmed physically, but something in the air was wrong. The library felt colder, heavier, like a tomb. The whispers didn't stop. Even after the police left and the library was closed, the staff swore they could still hear them. Soft at first, like a distant murmur, but over time they grew louder. And when the lights flickered, as they often did, the whispers seemed to fill the dark corners of the room. No one wanted to go near that desk anymore. No one spoke of it, but the rumors spread. They say the manuscript was cursed, that it had been waiting for Emily, waiting for someone to find it. They say the whispers still haunt the library, calling out, waiting for the next person to make the mistake of opening the book. It's been months since Emily disappeared, but the whispers are still there, and the manuscript? It's still missing, its twisted words scattered somewhere in the darkness, waiting. And as for the library, it's not the same anymore. It's colder now, quieter. And the air, it feels heavier, like it's waiting. Waiting for someone to find the forgotten manuscript. Greg had always been one of those students who preferred the stillness of the library to the noise of the campus. The quiet atmosphere, the musty smell of old books, the sound of pages turning, it felt like home. Every evening, after classes and assignments, he would make his way to the library, where he would settle in for hours of research, lost in the pages of textbooks and novels. And without fail, there was always one constant, Mrs. Harper, the librarian. She was a quiet woman, with graying hair that she always kept neatly pinned up, and a pair of glasses perched on the edge of her nose. Greg had noticed her many times, always at the same desk, always reading quietly, always alone. There was something serene about her presence, but there was also something unsettling, an eerie stillness that seemed to hang around her like a shadow. It wasn't that she ever did anything strange or alarming. She was simply always there, never seeming to leave. Greg would often find himself glancing at her from the corner of his eye as he worked, but she never acknowledged him. It was as though she existed in her own world, separate from the rest of the library. One night, Greg stayed later than usual. The library was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that only comes when the world outside has gone to sleep. The ticking of the clock echoed through the library, each minute dragging by, as if time itself had slowed to a crawl. He had been sitting at his usual table in the back, reading through notes for a research paper, when the clock struck 11:45 p.m. He had thought about leaving. The library closed soon, and the last bus back to campus was about to leave. But something kept him there. The work wasn't done yet. He had one more section to finish, one more page to go through. The world outside seemed to fade away as he lost himself in the study materials. Then suddenly he felt it. A shift in the air, a slight change, like the weight of the room had changed. Something didn't feel right. He glanced up. Mrs. Harper was standing at the far end of the long aisle of bookshelves, her back to him. It was an odd sight, even for her. She had never stood at that spot before, especially not this late. And yet, she stood there now, motionless, staring blankly at the shelves in front of her. Her posture was stiff, unnatural. For a moment, Greg thought maybe she was just looking for something, but the longer he stared, the more wrong it seemed. He stood up, heart pounding, and called out softly, "Mrs. Harper?" No response. Greg took a step forward, his shoes making soft tapping sounds against the old wooden floor. He was careful, hesitant, not sure why he felt this sudden sense of urgency. As he approached, the quiet hum of the fluorescent lights above seemed to grow louder in his ears, filling the space with an uncomfortable buzz. When he reached the end of the aisle, he stopped dead in his tracks. Something was wrong. He looked at her, at the back of her head, at the stillness of her form. And then something caught his eye. It was the reflection of her. There was a glass display case next to her, a showcase of old library artifacts and dusty tomes. And in the glass, Greg could see her, not just standing still, but frozen. She was staring at the wall, her eyes empty, vacant. The woman he had seen 1,000 times at that desk was gone, replaced by something cold, something lifeless in the reflection. Greg's breath caught in his throat, and a chill ran down his spine. He looked again, his eyes darting back and forth between the woman and her reflection. There was something wrong with the way her eyes stared into the emptiness. It wasn't a gaze, it was an empty stare, a kind of hollow vacancy that sent a shock of fear through him. He opened his mouth to speak again, but no sound came out. And then something happened. The reflection of Mrs. Harper smiled. Greg froze. He could feel his pulse pounding in his throat, and his legs seemed to turn to stone beneath him. The woman in the reflection grinned, slowly, deliberately, as if she knew something he didn't, something he shouldn't know. Her lips curled back, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too wrong. He spun around, his mind screaming at him to run. But just as he turned, something cold, so cold it felt like ice, wrapped around his wrist. His heart stopped. It wasn't the reflection that had touched him, but the real Mrs. Harper. Her hand, icy and stiff, gripping his wrist with a force that sent a sharp pain through his arm. Her fingers were unnaturally long, her nails digging into his skin with an almost malicious pressure. Greg let out a strangled gasp, trying to pull away, but her grip tightened, and he could feel something dark, something unseen pulling him in. He looked down at her hand, and as he did, he saw the same woman in the reflection, smiling wider now, her grin stretching impossibly, her eyes glinting with something terrifying. "Let go of me," Greg yelled, his voice cracking. But she didn't respond. She never responded. Her cold fingers dug deeper into his skin, and he felt an intense heat, almost as if her grip was burning him from the inside. A searing pain shot up his arm, and when he looked at his wrist, he saw it. The marks. Deep, angry red lines where her fingers had wrapped around him, and something darker, something more sinister in the spaces between. With everything in him, Greg wrenched himself away. He stumbled backward, nearly falling, his heart pounding in his chest, the fear almost choking him. When he looked back, Mrs. Harper was standing motionless, staring at the wall once again. But in the glass, her reflection smiled, her lips stretching wider, as if her grin would swallow him whole. Greg ran. He ran without looking back, his feet pounding against the floor as he sprinted toward the exit. He could hear his own breath, ragged and loud, in his ears. He reached the door, but as his hand touched the handle, something stopped him, something he couldn't explain. The door was locked, the entire library locked. Greg's stomach dropped. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as he turned around, desperate. He looked down the aisles, his mind racing, but the library was empty, silent. There was nothing. No one. And then the whisper. Greg. It came from nowhere. It came from everywhere. He ran to the windows, tried to push them open, but they were sealed shut. The shadows in the library seemed to close in on him, inching forward, suffocating him. He heard the clock ticking, tick-tock, tick-tock. The minutes dragged on forever. He could feel the weight of something watching him, pressing down on his chest, suffocating him. And then the door finally clicked open. Greg stumbled out, gasping for air, his eyes wide with terror. He could still feel the icy grip of Mrs. Harper's hand on his wrist, the blood still fresh where her fingers had burned him. But when he turned around, the library was dark. The lights were out, and there was no sign of her. No sign of anything. The police were called, but they found nothing. The library was locked from the inside, and Mrs. Harper was gone. There were no signs of struggle, no trace of what had happened. Greg's wrist was red, and his face was pale with fear, but he couldn't speak. He couldn't explain what he had seen, what he had felt. The librarian, Mrs. Harper, was never seen again. But every now and then, late at night, if you stand near the old library's glass case, you might catch a glimpse of something in the reflection. A twisted smile, sharp and knowing. A smile that promises she's still watching. Sarah had always enjoyed the quiet of the local library. The soft rustle of pages, the faint hum of the overhead lights, the comforting smell of old paper. It was a refuge for her. She volunteered at the small, unassuming branch, shelving books, helping patrons, and basking in the solitude. It was peaceful, but there was one thing about the library that unsettled her, something she could never quite explain. It was the silent shelf. It wasn't like any other part of the library. It was tucked away at the far end of the room, behind an old oak desk and a row of well-worn chairs. It was unassuming at first glance, but whenever Sarah passed by it, she would feel an odd sensation, a heavy presence, like the books were watching her. She had tried to shake it off, telling herself it was just her imagination, but every time her gaze lingered on the shelf, a chill would race up her spine. The books were all ordinary, mostly dusty hardcovers that had been forgotten by time. Yet, there was something about them that seemed wrong. The shelf was always perfectly still, yet every time Sarah dusted it or replaced a book, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for her there. One evening, Sarah stayed later than usual. The library was quiet, the last patron had left, and the sun had long since disappeared. The fluorescent lights flickered, casting an eerie glow over the rows of books. She was at the far end of the library, carefully dusting the shelves, when the lights blinked and went out, plunging the room into darkness. The sudden silence was deafening. Sarah froze, her heart hammering in her chest. She hated the dark, but she knew the building was safe. She reached out for the light switch, but before she could find it, she heard something, a whisper. Soft, low, and unsettling. It came from the silent shelf. A shiver ran down her spine. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling. There was no response. The whispering grew louder, almost insistent, though the words were indecipherable. It seemed to seep through the walls, around the books, like a whisper that had no origin, no end. It felt like the library itself was alive, breathing, waiting. Her curiosity, though laced with fear, got the better of her. Taking a deep breath, Sarah cautiously stepped toward the silent shelf, her steps quiet on the old wooden floor. As she approached, the air grew cold, biting at her skin, as though the darkness itself had wrapped its icy fingers around her. The whispering stopped abruptly. With her heart racing, Sarah reached for a book on the shelf. Just one, just to prove to herself that it was all in her head. Her fingers brushed against the leather-bound spine, and the moment she touched it, the coldness intensified, surrounding her like a thick fog. She pulled the book from the shelf, the pages creaking as she flipped it open. The musty scent of aged paper filled her nose, and her fingers trembled as she turned to the first page. In neat handwriting, a single sentence was written. "You will never leave." A chill ran through her veins. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The words burned into her mind, a stark warning that didn't make sense. She looked up from the book, her pulse pounding in her ears, but when she turned to leave, she noticed something else. The library door was locked. It hadn't been before. She was sure of it. Panic bubbled up inside her. She rushed toward the door, her hands fumbling with the handle. But it wouldn't budge. The door was sealed tight. Her heartbeat quickened as she backed away from the door. The silence in the library grew oppressive, thick with an unseen weight. She heard it then, a sound that shouldn't have been there. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps. They echoed through the library, each step seeming to get closer, though when Sarah spun around, no one was there. She searched the room, but the shelves were empty. The footsteps continued, a rhythmic sound that filled the air, only to stop suddenly. She turned back to the silent shelf. Something had changed. The books had shifted. They weren't in the same order as before. Some had fallen, others were askew, but in the center of the shelf was a single book, lying open. Sarah felt a pull, an urge to look at it. Her hand moved toward it without thinking, as though the book itself were calling her. Her fingers hesitated over the pages. But then, she read the message, just like the first book. "You belong here now." A cold gust of wind swept through the room, causing the pages of the book to rustle. The temperature plummeted, and Sarah's breath came out in visible clouds. Her heart raced, the panic almost suffocating her. The whispering returned, this time louder, more urgent. It was as though the library itself was screaming at her. In a blind panic, Sarah grabbed the first book she had picked up. She ran toward the door again, slamming her shoulder against it, but it still wouldn't open. She turned back to the shelf. It was too quiet now. The whispering was gone, and then the footsteps started again. They were no longer echoing from across the room. They were behind her. She spun around, her eyes wild with fear, but there was no one there. Only darkness, pressing in on her from all sides. The library felt like it was closing in on her, the air thick with an unseen presence that she could not escape. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. Suddenly, the book in her hand felt wrong. It burned in her palms, its pages growing warmer by the second. She threw it to the floor, but it didn't land. Instead, it hovered there, just above the ground, as if the book were alive, waiting, watching. She turned back to the door, her fingers shaking as she gripped the handle one last time. She pulled, but it was no use. It was locked, impossibly locked. She heard it then, a voice, so close it felt like it was inside her head. "You will never leave." The last thing Sarah saw was the flicker of the lights, just before the darkness claimed her. Days later, the library was opened for the morning shift. The police found Sarah's body, cold and lifeless, sitting on the floor beside the silent shelf. Her eyes were wide open, her face pale, and her fingers were clutching a book, the book. It was gone when they checked, but the shelves were now perfectly in order. But if you look closely, if you stand in the library late at night and listen closely to the silence, you might hear something, a whisper, low and cold. "You belong here now." It was late, later than usual. The library was empty except for Lucy, the lone night shift worker. She had always preferred the quiet. The stillness of the library after hours was comforting, almost peaceful. She could focus on her work without interruptions, the silence only broken by the occasional rustle of pages or the hum of the overhead lights. But tonight something felt different. Something felt off. Lucy had heard the rumors. the whispered stories about strange happenings in the library. The other staff had warned her, but she'd always brushed it off. Ghost stories, they'd said. Odd sounds, flickering lights, nothing more. The rational part of her always took over, and she laughed it off as just that, stories. That was until she started noticing something strange. Something she couldn't explain away. It started with the footsteps. At first, it was just a soft sound, like someone walking behind her in the narrow aisles between the book stacks. She'd turn quickly, expecting to see a colleague or maybe a stray patron, but no one was there. The shelves stretched on in every direction, empty as always. At first, she told herself it was just her imagination. She was tired. Maybe she was hearing things. But it didn't stop. The footsteps came again and again. Slow, deliberate, as if someone were walking just behind her, shadowing her every step. Then it was the feeling. A breath, hot and cold at once, on the back of her neck. The sensation that someone was standing right behind her, too close to ignore. She would spin around, her heart racing, expecting to see someone. But again, there was nothing. The aisles were empty, the air still, but she couldn't shake the feeling. It grew stronger every night, as if whatever, or whoever, was there was waiting, watching. Lucy tried to convince herself it was nothing. The library was old, the pipes creaked, and the building made strange noises at night. But no matter how much she told herself that, the sensation didn't go away. It only grew more unsettling. One night, she decided to stay even later than usual. She wasn't going to let her nerves get the best of her. She would stay, do her work, and prove to herself that there was nothing to be afraid of. As she walked past the row of old bookshelves, she heard it again, a soft whisper, barely audible. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She froze. Lucy. The voice was just loud enough to make her stomach churn, but too soft to identify the source. Her breath caught in her throat. Lucy turned toward the aisle where the sound had come from, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew she wasn't alone anymore. She could feel it deep down, a presence. Something watching her, waiting for her to make the next move. At the far end of the aisle, just out of sight, she saw it. A shadow. It didn't move. It didn't breathe. But it was there, and it was watching her. Lucy's heart hammered in her chest as she took a shaky step forward. She squinted, trying to make sense of what she was seeing, but the shadow didn't shift, didn't reveal itself. It was just there, watching, waiting. Her pulse quickened. She could feel its eyes on her, even though she couldn't see them. A shiver ran down her spine. She turned on her heel and sprinted for the door, her mind racing, but when she reached the exit, her breath caught in her throat. The door slammed shut. She tried to pull it open, but it wouldn't budge. Her hands scrambled against the handle, desperate, but it was locked tight. The shadow was behind her now, and she could feel it, closer, closer than ever before. She turned around, her heart nearly leaping out of her chest. There was no one there, no figure, no movement. But the footsteps followed her, slow, deliberate, echoing in the empty library. Each step came closer, louder. She backed away, her chest tightening with fear. The silence was broken only by the steady echo of the footsteps. But no one was there. The shadow loomed, invisible but real. She could feel it like a weight pressing down on her. It was closing in. It had always been there, waiting for her. Lucy turned toward the door again, her hands shaking as she tried to unlock it. But when she looked back, the shadow was closer. Too close. It was like it had never been far away at all. With one final surge of panic, she managed to wrench the door open. She ran, heart pounding, feet pounding against the cold floor, desperate to get out of the library. As she fled into the night, she thought she could hear something else, a faint whisper that trailed behind her, following her every step. Lucy. It was soft at first, almost like the wind, but it grew louder, closer, familiar. By the time she reached her car, her pulse was erratic, her hands clammy on the steering wheel. She locked the doors, but she couldn't escape the feeling that she wasn't alone. The whisper didn't stop. That night, Lucy didn't sleep. She couldn't. Every time she closed her eyes, The sound of footsteps echoed in her mind. A breath on the back of her neck. The feeling that someone was standing just behind her, waiting, watching. And the whisper. Always the whisper. She thought she'd escaped the library. But the whisper followed her. It never stopped. Every night after that, it was the same. The footsteps, the breath, the shadow. And the whisper. Lucy. It followed her home. It followed her to work. It followed her wherever she went, a dark presence just beyond the edges of her vision, always just out of reach. And then one night, after weeks of torment, it stopped. But it didn't go away. Lucy returned to the library the next day, determined to face whatever it was. She had to know what had been following her. She had to confront the thing that had haunted her every step. The library was empty, like always. But the stacks felt different now. Like they were waiting, watching. Lucy walked to the end of the aisle, where it had all started, and stood there for a moment. The whisper hadn't returned, but she could still feel it, like the shadow was behind her, just out of sight. She turned, her body trembling, and when she looked into the reflection in the glass case beside her, her breath caught. The shadow was standing there, just behind her. But it wasn't a shadow anymore. It was her. And that was when Lucy realized the truth. The whisper wasn't following her anymore. It had become her. James had always been a regular at the library, but tonight, something was different. The usual comfort of the place, the quiet rustle of pages turning, the faint scent of old books. All of it seemed to hang in the air like a breath held too long. It was the stillness of the night, a time when the library was his sanctuary, a place where he could escape the world, where time slowed and the pages of his books filled the spaces that words couldn't reach. He'd made it a habit to read into the late hours, finding peace by the back windows, where the moonlight filtered in through the blinds. The soft light cast strange, shifting shadows on the floor, almost like whispers from another world. This corner, his corner, was perfect for him. It had become a ritual, a place where he felt at ease, a place where he could be alone. But tonight, when he stepped into the library, he noticed something that unsettled him. Someone was already sitting in his chair. At first, he couldn't make out the figure, just a silhouette against the dim light. A man hunched slightly forward, with a book resting in his hands. His clothes were simple, nothing unusual, but there was something about him that felt wrong. A strange pull in the air, like the temperature had dropped just slightly. James hesitated for a moment, then stepped further into the room, making his way down the familiar aisles of bookshelves. As he drew closer to the corner, his eyes locked with the man's. The man's eyes were dark, too dark. They weren't just brown or black like most people's. They were a void like pools of ink, endless and deep, swallowing everything in their path. His gaze was fixed, unwavering. No smile, no movement. Just a still, intense stare that sent a shiver crawling up James's spine. James froze. For a moment, he wasn't sure whether to speak or leave. The man made no effort to acknowledge his presence, didn't even blink. It was like he wasn't really there, not in the way James was. Feeling uneasy, James finally broke the silence. "Excuse me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, unsure if the man had even heard him. The man didn't reply. He didn't even move. James stood there for a long, awkward moment, feeling the weight of the stranger's gaze on him. Something about this felt wrong. The air seemed thicker now, like it was pressing in on him from all sides. The urge to leave was strong, but curiosity kept him in place. Slowly, he stepped around the man and sat down in the chair next to him, trying to shake off the feeling that had settled deep in his chest. He opened his book, but as he read, something was off. The man didn't move, didn't shift his posture, didn't even blink. His eyes stayed locked on James, never once leaving his face. James tried to focus on his reading, but it was impossible. Every time he glanced up, the man's eyes were still on him. The weight of that stare was like a heavy hand pressing down on his chest. It made it hard to breathe, hard to think. After what felt like an eternity, James could no longer take it. He stood abruptly, intending to walk out. His fingers clenched the edge of the table, and as he took a step toward the door, the sound of footsteps echoed behind him. Soft at first, faint but unmistakable. James froze. He turned slowly, expecting to see the man following him, perhaps with some explanation. But when he turned around, the man was gone. The chair was empty. The room was still, quiet, just like it had been when he'd first entered. Confused, James stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of what had just happened. His heart was pounding in his chest as he slowly walked back to the chair. He sat down, unsure of what he was feeling. Was it relief? Or was it something darker, something that gnawed at him from the inside? As he sank into the seat, something strange happened. James looked up at the window beside him, half expecting to see the reflection of the empty library behind him. But the reflection wasn't empty. There, in the glass, was the man from earlier. He was sitting in the chair, just as he had been. The same posture, the same book, the same unnerving, unmoving stare. But it wasn't just his reflection. The reflection was smiling. A slow, unsettling grin spread across the man's face, his eyes still dark, still empty. The kind of smile that made James's blood run cold. James's breath caught in his throat. He didn't move, didn't even blink. The smile and the reflection stayed there, mocking him, as though it knew something he didn't. The reflection tilted its head slightly, as if it had noticed James staring at it. It knows, James thought. It knows I'm here. Panic surged in him. His heart raced. His hands gripped the arms of the chair, nails digging into the worn fabric. He wanted to scream, but no sound escaped his throat. He wanted to run, but his legs felt like lead. With a sudden burst of fear, James stood up, backing away from the window, his eyes never leaving the glass. He turned, looking frantically for a way out, but the library doors were locked. He couldn't move fast enough, couldn't get away from the reflection that now seemed to be pulling him in. And then, just as suddenly as it had all started, the door swung open. The morning staff, the ones who opened the library at the crack of dawn, stepped in, their voices light and cheerful. They glanced around, expecting to see their usual morning crowd. But there was no one there. No one except for the book. It was sitting in the chair, just like the man had been. The book was open, its pages gently turning in the early morning breeze, but the chair was empty. They approached the book, puzzled. On the inside cover, there was a name written in neat, elegant handwriting, James. But there was no sign of him, no sign of the man. Just an empty room, an open book, and the lingering feeling of someone or something watching.